welcome, McKenna Lewellen. So glad to have you as part of this dialogue sermon series called Aha Moments, New Voices Shedding Light. I just wanted to give you a welcome by telling everyone who you are, but I'm so glad that you're here.
It is so good to be here.
Welcome. McKenna is a queer disabled, almost pastor, almost because I was privileged to be at the Baltimore Presbytery meeting where we certified her ready to receive a call. In this last 12 months, we were able to do that. Time means nothing, so I can't remember when this was, in the fall. So we are so excited because that basically means that she is going to be ordained to whatever position she takes on next. So she is essentially a fellow colleague of mine now, and she gave the most wonderful statement of faith that inspired me to invite her here. McKenna went to divinity school at Boston University, where her studies focused on theology and embodiment. She has lived and worked in Baltimore for the last 4 years and serves as the assistant director of the Center, an initiative of the Presbytery of Baltimore that hosts mission experiences and accompanies local churches and leaders as they reimagine community engagement. Welcome, McKenna, again.
Thank you. Thank you.
My first question for you, McKenna, is how does your identity in the world, so you as a human born with your body in this place and in this time, how does that shape your faith and your calling?
Yeah. So, for most of our conversation today, I want to talk about disability, but that's not the only way that my body is marked. The it doesn't. It's not limited to disability the way I experience the world. So I am a disabled queer feminist. And so having that as my family, as my root in the world, means that my faith isn't mine. These are communities of people that are like deeply, deeply relationship based and are thinking about a community and not an individual. Which is really different from the way most white American Christians think about faith. It's sort of become this like individual endeavor or practice, something that like one person assents to on their own, and then you kind of gather together to do things, but it's really about what the individual person believes. But I have come to see faith because of these communities as something that I have and practice against this like huge backdrop of people who've come before me, and then alongside this community of people, preparing the way for more people after us. And then my faith and sense of color also, and this is where it's gonna feel like we're taking a really bummer sharp turn, is deeply shaped by two communities, the queer community and the disabled community, that have had to and continue to reckon with death and violence. And so my theology had to account for experiences that some of my classmates and colleagues like couldn't imagine being part of regular life. I got called a pessimist a lot before March 2020. But when the world's on fire like it is right now, I have access to language and practices that can sort of bear up to what's going on, because like the world right now is just a large scale version of what queer people and disabled people have known for a long time, and experienced both in our history and now. And then I think to sort of edge us out of like the bummerness of that, I think that one of my faculty in divinity school does a lot of work around trauma. And when she starts to introduce the idea of how she writes her theology, she says a lot of theology sees the way that suffering like breaks things apart. So like it'll look at a shattered piece of glass and the theology thinks its task is to put that glass back together and make it okay again. And she says, we can't do that. There's no point in trying. It's just going to break again. Like the world is that hard. If it broke it the first time, it's going to break it again. And so the task becomes not putting it back together, but meeting it in its shattered fragments and trusting that God is there. And so I think that has really become my lens for approaching church life and theology. not trying to like patch things up and make them okay, but just meeting them in their like messiness and weirdness, and trusting that those things are holy and sacred.
Amen. I love that. My second question is sort of related, McKenna, and it is related to this whole series. And that is, can you tell us a story of a time when you had an aha moment about this world and about your place in it?
So I was born with one condition, and then the came by the second more prominent one that I live with later. I don't know that there was a particular moment that I was taught that having a chronic condition was like shameful or something to hide, but like most people in our culture, I internalized that really, really early. Um, the second condition that I had became really, really pronounced when I got to college. And I spent a lot of time lying about what was going on with my body, and trying to find ways to prove that it wasn't impacting my daily life. But of course, it was like huge in my landscape. I was having trouble walking, and I would tell people that it was just like a knee injury. I had to stay off of my knee and use crutches. Which was a huge lie. It impacted my vision and my hearing. So I was like desperately trying to figure out how to use accessibility features on my laptop, or like if I didn't have a PDF of a reading, my roommates would have to read to me. Um, and then it started to affect my speech fluency, which if you're trying to tell people that you're smart and you're like, you deserve to be in a class, there's, it's really hard to like keep that facade up when it sounds like your brain is working slower. And so I would say that I had laryngitis like over and over again, to the point that my choir director like told me to go see a doctor. And one of my faculty was advising some research that I was doing and teaching one of my classes, and was a very smart lady and sort of saw what was going on. And instead of confronting me and like basically forcing me to disclose a disability, she slid a book across the desk and said, I think that this would help your research. And I opened this book, and it was called The Wounding and Healing of Desire, Weaving Heaven and Earth by Wendy Farley, who was a prominent feminist theologian at a like top tier graduate school, at like the top of her career and her field. And the first line of the introduction of this book was, when I was 41, I lost the ability to read. And I stopped and like read it over to make sure that I'd read it right. And then read that introduction like 6 times because she was sustaining a trauma that resulted in an 18-month migraine that meant she couldn't read. She was a professor. She had to read, she had to write. And her faculty chair in her department had allowed her to continue working. She was teaching classes and would assign reading, and she just had to walk into the room, and whatever was in her head was what she had to teach with. So her teaching became really conversational. And she wrote this whole book during that period where she couldn't go to a library and like pick up another conversation partner. She just like, whatever was in her head was what she was writing. And so it generated this whole different way of writing for her, like a very different book than she'd put out before. And she had done it because she had disclosed a disability, like right up front. And so it opened up this whole new world for me, where like it was possible for someone at the top of her game to disclose a disability and still be taken seriously, still have a book published, still be teaching, because her colleagues were willing to be flexible and creative and trust her. And because she was willing to take a risk. And so like this whole new world became possible for me. And then I had to like start living in the world, right? I got out of school, and the church world is really different from the like pocket of academia that I found myself in, where I was able to function in that way. And I found, not just in individual churches, but sort of in our larger institution, this complete inability to deal with disability or to think creatively about accessibility. 95% of the time, I'm being met with things like, if you can't hack it here, go somewhere else. Because the church is not legally required to be accessible. It is not legally, it fought really hard to keep the Americans with Disabilities Act from being passed. And so, it's not subject to those rules. And so it's just not become a part of our culture to have to deal with it. And so we don't. So anyway, those are like two very different ahas, but like very central to how I understand myself in the world.
I appreciate so far that with your calling, with these aha moments, you're able to hold the good news things along with the hard news things. We just heard a sermon about that a few weeks ago from a guest preacher about tolerating that ambiguity as part of our faith.
Yeah.
So I love that. You know what a lot of the churches in the presbytery are like, McKenna. We are not so different from most of the churches in the presbytery in that we are a majority white congregation in a suburban neighborhood, Protestant church, of course. What do you want churches like ours, if you had it your way, to be thinking about and talking about right now?
Yeah. I want churches to be talking about our death. But I want us to be really excited about it. Like I don't want it to be like a slog through budgets and like building assessments, and like just grief laden. Like there's going to be grief, but I also think that churches that know how to talk about their own finite reality are churches that are more willing to be flexible and take risks, and churches that can see possibility in the middle of something that's been maybe stagnant. Churches are really good at tradition and really good at replicating systems that have worked in the past. The future of the white Protestant church does not look like it does right now. And I don't say that like a prophecy, that something that could happen. I'm saying that because if the church is going to exist in the future, it can't look like it does now, because the church as it exists right now is dying. So whatever is alive in the future is not this. And that's really okay. And that's really exciting. It might feel scary, but it genuinely gives me hope and a deeper desire to stay here. And I think like we don't have to talk about like shutting our church building down, right? But I think churches that can start asking questions like, what is like causing us to stagnate? Like, are there things here that are causing us to die? Are there things here that mean death for other people? Have we been complicit in the death of things before that we shouldn't have been? And if something were to die here, what new life would be possible if that happened? And it's something that I think we're gonna have to reckon with really soon. The way that we've done church works really well for able-bodied people. We are seeing right now the like single biggest increase in the disability community since polio in this country, and like no one is talking about it and no one is ready, particularly in the church. There are going to be a huge number of people who have like long-term respiratory illnesses, long-term heart issues, long-term neurological conditions, and that's like not even talking about the mental health consequences of the pandemic. And so the way that we do church right now, not right now, the way that we were doing church in March of 2020 might not be the best fit for whatever happens when we come back. Like, are we ready to come back in our space and have like someone have their first panic attack because it's really scary to be in a place with lots of people with no masks? Like, are we ready for someone to have a cardiovascular episode in the middle of worship? Like, are we standing too much? Are we like judging people for sitting down in church? like what in our traditions is valuable and can help us make sense of the things that are happening in the world, but also like what in our practices and traditions could die and make room for something new to happen. Yeah, so it's like scary and good and full of possibility.
And it feels like what you're saying, in a way, McKenna, is that communities like the disabled community have particular gifts to offer churches right now because of this age, this new age that we're in, because of the things they've already been thinking about this entire time. You said that in your introduction.
Yeah, and I think one of the sort of shifts in question asking that we can make starting now is not like the classic white Protestant church, like how can I help those suffering people? Like it's happening somewhere else and like I have a solution to it. But like how can we as a community full of different kinds of people start making our community a more just place? And that's like a hugely different question. That's like the difference between like starting a subcommittee to raise money for somebody who's suffering somewhere else, which is fine, like always give money to people who need it. But like instead it's how can we be collaborative and imaginative to make our place of worship and our community available to lots of different kinds of people.
One of the questions I had for you is on a much more personal level. When you think of how the world sees you on the outside, the labels, they might put on you accurately or inaccurately, versus what's available on the inside. What do you think might surprise people about you? What do you wish people knew about you?
Yeah. So I think, so I have a very like fashion forward cane that I use. And it is collapsible so I can put it in my backpack or travel with it really easily. And someone might look at me and feel confused because I'm like 28 years old and using a mobility aid. And I'm not using it all the time, just sometimes anyway. And so someone might look at me and think like, oh, poor girl, which like literally has been said out loud to me several times when I go to guest preach, like, oh, what happened to you? What's wrong with you? And so the way that I feel when I am like rocking this cane in like a really cool blazer and a blouse that I like, and I'm like rolling into a church to preach, like I feel good. And the perception is like something's wrong and I must need help. So I am disabled and I don't want to cure. I think is maybe the thing that might surprise people the most. I am not a person with a disability. Like my disability isn't like a removable part from who I am. It's like integral to who I am as a person. There's an emerging model called the social model of disability that says that I have an impairment or an illness, but I'm not disabled by the illness. I'm disabled by the world around me. So I am not disabled by my illness. I am disabled by stairs. I am disabled by inaccessible resources, and I'm disabled by people's assumptions about me.
Oh, thank you. I love that. My last official question for you is, McKenna, what scripture uplifts you and emboldens you for these times that we're living in?
Mark 2, the start of Mark 2, the friends who lower their disabled friend through the roof of a house because they can't get in through the door. They dig an accessible entrance, which how sweet, right? Like a community of friends gets together, sees a problem, sees a possibility, digs an accessible entrance. So first, I love this passage because it reminds us that accessibility requires creativity, community, persistence, and doing things that might seem totally absurd, and might require us to modify our buildings. And then I also love it because in Jesus's day, disability wasn't about sickness. It was often a marker of rebellious people. Enslaved people who had disobeyed their owners were injured to prevent escape or to make their work more painful. People who defied the Roman Empire were injured publicly to make an example of them. And so only a couple of people who approached Jesus for healing are said like specifically to have been disabled from birth. Most of the people who encounter him are sick or have likely been given a chronic condition or been disabled by the empire or by their owners. And so healing in the Gospels, and it's like especially prominent in this text is like usually read as like someone seeking a cure, like they want a cure for their disability. But for Jesus, disability, because disability was like the result of cruel punishment or retribution, healing a disabled body was like so much more than a cure, right? It was a political statement that these disabling forces of Rome and slavery like did not have a place in God's kingdom. It had in God's kingdom, those like retributive forces would be wiped away. And so, yeah, I find myself thinking a lot about the friends who dug a hole in a roof.
I love that interpretation of that story. Thank you. That just opens it up in a whole new way. Is there anything else that you would like to share with us, McKenna? Anything we have not touched on?
I think I hope that people just get curious about this. We were talking before that like disability is something that we don't know how little we know about it until it impacts our own body, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere, right? And so finding ways to be curious and to start thinking about this more right now before we face this like wave of new members to the disability community being in our own buildings and being people that we love, I think is the next thing, right? We just got to start asking good questions.
Thank you so much for sharing your voice and your story and yourself with us today. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.